questions and suggestions coming from the audience. And I'd like to point out that today we are experimenting with a new format. As you can see here, we have a hashtag #AskBruegel. We're going to have a number of people who are joining in on the live stream for this event. There's a very big interest, obviously, on the topic. And we would like to also receive questions from the people who are watching online. We have the hashtag there, so you're all welcome to pose questions. I will be looking at the questions as they come in, and then we can open up the floor to the audience here in Brussels and further afield. So without further ado, we will have a presentation by both our guests, and I believe Niels will start first, followed by Matthäus, and then, as I said, half an hour later we'll open up the floor. Niels, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria. It's a pleasure to be invited here to Bruegel, where the subject of today's meeting is a very familiar one. I can think of no other institution outside the official world, at least, where fiscal issues in Europe have been discussed more intensively, and I want to give credit to Jean-Pierre Ferry, André Sapir, a number of others, Gregory Claes, Guntram Wolf, of course, have all written about the subject. So it's a challenging thing for us to appear here and face your usual audience. But you may remember that in 2015 there was a report from the so-called 5 presidents of the European institutions looking into the future economic governance of the euro area. They made a number of longer-term proposals, and some of them we will probably come back to today also, but they made one short-term proposal, which was in fact implemented so far, namely the setup of an independent European Fiscal Board, which was to advise the Commission and indeed the rest of the official world on fiscal issues in Europe. And this body was duly set up, as you said, exactly a year ago, and we have worked quite hard, the 5 of us, in addition to Matthäus and myself. There are 3 others with a rich policy experience and academic experience. I can say that we have been able to collaborate quite closely and reach agreement, first on a temporary report on one part of our mandate, which came out last June, the idea of a so-called euro area fiscal stance, which the Commission has developed in recent years, and which basically asks the question, is there a need, in addition to the sum of the national policy recommendations on fiscal policy, for the euro area to take a view of its overall stance? That's an old position. I'll come back to that at the very end also. But we were set up and mainly with a double mandate. Our first task, and that is now on the screen, I see, was to evaluate the implementation of the current Union fiscal framework regarding both the consistency across countries over time in the applications of the rather detailed framework that the European Union, indeed, but particularly the euro area countries, has developed over the last few years. That was the first part, and a more tedious part, possibly, many will say, of our mandate, because that required a rather detailed piece of work, and we certainly couldn't have done that without having an excellent, hard-working secretariat that was familiar already to some extent, in not great detail, with the institutional framework in the European Commission, the work done at DG ECFIN in particular in the Commission. We started on that subject, and that is the first part of our report. But the other part of our mandate is more forward-looking and maybe more in line with what you have been discussing in more outside the official world. The appropriateness of the actual fiscal stance, I already made some comments about the idea of a euro area fiscal stance. The problem with that we soon reached understanding of was, of course, it was not easy to implement anything jointly without some changes, basic changes in the governance system, and that belongs therefore also on the agenda for the longer-term reforms. Point number 3, suggestions for the future evolution of the Union fiscal framework. That is an open-ended mandate that depends a bit on also what comes up, and indeed over the 1 year where we have been in existence, a number of governments have proposed ideas for the future evolution of the Union fiscal framework, not always concordant ones, but the agenda is much richer now. We are only dealing with these longer-term issues in a preliminary way in this report, but we do raise them, and we will certainly come back to them in our future work in 2018 and 19. We're nominated, I should say, so far for 3 years, so we have at least 2 more annual reports to come. The final part of our mandate, listed at the bottom here, is to cooperate with the national fiscal councils. In addition to the centralized surveillance framework that has been developed centering around the European semester and carried out largely by the European Commission, there has, of course, been an effort at decentralization of surveillance after the crisis. All countries now in the Euro area and the European Union have national fiscal councils that are independent, participate in the national debate, evaluate government forecasts, and the way in which governments comply with either the European rules or the slightly different, sometimes national rules that fill the same purpose. We collaborate with these national fiscal councils. We draw on their experience. They are as fiercely independent as we try to be, so we are not really coordinating the activities. We're trying to develop some ideas about best practice, and we will come back to that also in presenting this current report. Let me go a little bit further and look at a couple of the conclusions to summarize them. Then Matthäus will come back with much more detail. In looking at the current system of rules, we have focused on one particular year, the most recent year, for which there was a total cycle of surveillance activities. That's the calendar year 2016, that is last year. Other institutions, notably the IMF, has done a lot of empirical work on how the fiscal rules have worked over time, and that is certainly also interesting, but maybe not that easy a task, because the rules have changed. They have evolved a lot since 1999 or 1997, when the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the core of this system, was adopted. So it's not easy to interpret in one empirical framework how the rules have worked. So we focused instead, and that was necessary indeed, to choose a narrow focus on 2016 and see more in detail how have the rules been applied. It's fair to say, I think, that there have been major criticism of the working of the rules, and I mentioned the 2 main points here. Some have said there's been too much relaxation, rules have become much too supple, and that is detrimental to the sustainability of public finances. Others have said, no, that's not the case. The rules are still much too rigid. They are one size fits all to a too large extent, and they have indeed hampered the recovery, undermined the fragile recovery, which we have seen, fortunately, since 2014. So we go into detail in settling what is really the situation. What are the degrees of flexibility and imperfection with which the rule system has been applied in 2015. And that is no easy task, but we come up with a number of more specific points where we have had question marks about how the rules have been applied. But I state here that our main conclusion is that on balance, there have not been gross errors in the management of the system. The 2 dangers that are mentioned in the bullet points just above did not materialize. There was not a massive undermining of the rules through relaxation, nor was there, in our view, I think, a very rigid application of the rules. So the rules have not worked too badly in 2016. How they're working now, we don't know, but we're going to follow up certainly in future reports with similar assessments of the coming years. But the climate has become somewhat easier, obviously, also since 2016 because of the recovery, which is continuing. That was indeed part of the explanation why we concluded in our June report about the euro area fiscal stance that we did not see any major need for a special euro area fiscal stance for 2018, given the relatively good outlook and the gradual closing of the output gap, an inexact concept, but nevertheless one which plays a central role, and whatever measure you use for slack in our economies, that degree of slack has been reduced over the past 3 or 4 years, and certainly even more in 2017 maybe than before. So we discussed this balance between relaxation and rigidity, and we do, on the basis of that examination, come up with a number of suggestions as to how the rules could be improved within mainly the framework of the current framework in this section, but also looking, of course, at some of the proposals that are now there for the longer-term future. I think I have mentioned most of this, but I can just, in concluding my own intervention at this point, say that the situation in 2016 turned out to be less alarming, less critical than was thought at the beginning. It also shows how the uncertainty of forecasts influences the budgetary discussion. When there was first an assessment in 2016 by the Commission in early 2015, of course an early stage of forecasting for a year ahead, it looked as if budgetary plans would present sizable problems of compliance. But exposed, in fact, there was much less of a problem. Nominal growth was about the same as expected, inflation lower, GDP real growth a bit higher, but the gap was closed by precisely the applying the rules with some elements of discretion and flexibility, and also giving some extra time to countries that had difficulty in meeting the objectives. I think I will stop here at this point and come back maybe at towards the end with the longer-term outlook for the more ambitious ideas for the longer term. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What Niels has just said about the sizable compliance gaps ex ante and most of them vanishing exposed, in many cases it meant nothing wrong. I mean, it was just the recourse to existing degrees of discretion is envisaged by the rules, and that is certainly not a problem. There was one problem that we saw, that which we will refer to a bit later, is linked with the recourse to a nominal strategy by the countries under the excessive deficit procedure that were benefiting from faster growth and extra spending, and instead of using this to pursue the structural adjustment, they were just content with the extra budgetary income that it brought. There were some cases of that, and we will come back to some proposals how to fix that in the future. Now, to the details. There were no gross errors, but there were some things that did raise our eyebrows. One, in the preventive arm of the Stability and Growth Pact. First of all, as you know, the assessment of compliance is based both on structural balance and expenditure benchmarks. These two indicators, and they are meant to mean a similar thing, but in practice, different messages might be given depending on where we look. And it is a natural source of tension. So what to do with a country that is compliant looking at structural balance, but is not compliant in terms of expenditure benchmark. There have been attempts to solve this issue and to give a greater weight on expenditure benchmark, which personally I quite like. But at the same time, There are some countries, 2 or 3, that still like the structural balance, and that gives rise to problems with assessment of compliance. So there are some inconsistencies across time, across countries. The same country has been assessed that structural balance is better, and in some other time there's, well, let's look at the expenditure benchmark instead. So that's one thing that still I think remains to be solved, because it's not going to be easy to match these at all times. It will give rise to discretion, which is not necessarily wrong. Judgment is often necessary, and our own existence, in a sense, is giving credit to the value of independent judgment. But it's important to make sure that this judgment is explained very, very carefully. The second thing in the preventive arm is the use of flexibility clauses. And one particular example was that there was no firm conclusion by the Commission whether Italy implemented the required structural reforms or not. They were given this flexibility on the assumption that the certain structural reforms will be completed, and when it came to the ex-post evaluation, it was just not mentioned at all in the Commission assessment. In the corrective arm of SGP, well, we've watched the saga of Spain and Portugal. There were a number of items that were somewhat problematic. First of all, the recommended extension for Spain and Portugal in May 2016 was in conflict with existing country council recommendations. The assessment of effective action was delayed until July 2016, and this resulted in insufficient time to actually for the SGP to bite and to for the European Parliament, for example, to debate or decide whether to do something with the structural investment funds to these countries. Then the question of the debt rule and the debt reduction in Belgium, Italy, and Finland. There was no procedure launched thanks to a broad interpretation of relevant factors. And the assumption was that the situation we're in, especially very low inflation, is such that that if the countries adhere to the deficit rule, then the debt procedure need not to be launched. And finally, the early and late submissions of draft budgetary plans. Spain submitted its plans too early, Portugal too late. It's always a problem of conflict with new government, new elections, and whether what to do with these cases. It seems that now there's been some resolution and some decisions how to deal with such cases when there's a provisional government or no government at all. What to submit actually under the fiscal compact. We did publish a report, a forward-looking report on the fiscal euro area fiscal stance. But at the same time, in the upcoming report looking back, we also look at the fiscal stance in 2016 and assess that it's broadly appropriate. It was broadly appropriate, both ex ante and ex post. The problem that, of course, remains is that the fact that overall the outcome was in line with expectations and the outcome of recovery after a long, deep crisis. Still extremely low interest rates and constrained monetary policy on one side, but very high debt ratios and risk of sustainability in some countries on the other. So with the hindsight, the observed and slightly expansionary aggregate fiscal stance was appropriate in the view of European Fiscal Board, but at the same time, its split between various countries was probably not optimal, and the countries that had fiscal space did not use it maybe as much as they could. At the same time, the countries that had a problem of debt sustainability, or bigger problem of debt sustainability, were using it maybe slightly too much. There is a background slide of which I will not refer to too long about how we deal with the fiscal stance overall. We look not just as the euro area European Commission output gap estimates, also other institutions, the IMF, ECB, or OECD, and a broad set of additional indicators. Especially the stage of the monetary policy where we're in. But at the same time, we do have to look at the fiscal stance of the euro area via or through the boundaries of the EU fiscal rules. And it's a very important thing that we might end up in a situation where fiscal rules prevent the euro area from getting the optimal fiscal stance. It was not the case last year, but provided that the countries that had fiscal space were using it to some extent. The next part of our mandate is the role, the cooperation with independent fiscal institutions. As Neil said, they're independent not just by name; they're very independent, and they guard independence very closely, like we do. So it's certainly not our role to say to anyone what to do in this respect. What we tried to do was to have a deeper look at the examples of a long-serving and big institutions on one side, and the smaller, sort of newer additions to the group of independent fiscal institutions, and see how the functions could be best used, given limited resources sometimes. And one particular area that we would like to draw attention to is the comply or explain principle that should, in our view, be strengthened through maybe better anchoring these provisions in national legislation, ensuring better, sort of more extensive application of the tool. It would certainly be useful for the coherence of the overall fiscal framework. Now this brings me to forward-looking proposals for improving the Stability and Growth Pact. Some of the things we did refer to already, and I think Niels would like to.
You're doing very well, so.
I can start with the first one.
Why don't you do that?
If you allow me. First of all, there's a question of symmetry of the fiscal rules. There is a number of flexibilities in the way European fiscal rules are applied in case of bad times, and it's a good thing. If a situation gets far worse, we have a big recession, the updated excessive deficit procedure recommendations are available, allowing less pro-cyclical fiscal policy. It's certainly a right thing to do. At the same time, In cases of a surprisingly good business climate, surprisingly good growth, there are no such recommendations. And the general problem of the fiscal rules of the European Union is the fact that they are not binding when they really, really should be, when times are good. It's no surprise that it is very difficult to punish countries when they fail to meet the requirements during the recession, because it will be counterproductive. And credibility of sanctions is limited, but at the same time, the sanctions really should be biting, and the rules should be strict when times are good. And here, the rules are somewhat lacking. So we believe, for example, updating the EDP recommendations following positive economic surprises would be very useful. It would reduce this tendency to use nominal strategy and just to rely on better tax income to get out of the excessive deficit procedure and this strange gap that we have, that it's actually more convenient to stay in the excessive deficit procedure than to be in the preventive arm, which sometimes can be more strict. There's no such way out. There's always this reference to structural balance there. Secondly, the targets are defined somewhat. The flexibility towards the targets are overused. So if the country is almost reaching the MTO, or almost on the right path of the MTO, and is broadly compliant, it's all right. But if it does so year after year after year, then the actual target is different. And we did find, and if you could fast forward to the hyperlink, maybe I'll just do it. If you look at the margins of uncertainty on the screen, the colors represent broad compliance. Compliance are green, broad compliance yellow, and the risk of non-compliance for the individual countries. And how they sum up, we see that there is a number of countries that are sort of just all right. But in fact, if you look at the 4-year horizon, this gap is getting rather big. So what we would like to propose is essentially an account which would force the countries that are overly reliant on this margins of uncertainty to pay it back by a bit tighter fiscal policy down the line. Similar setup exists in a number of national legislations, for example, in the German debt brake. And here, I will pass the back to the boss.
Thank you very much, Mateusz. It is, of course, evident, I think, that in a situation where the economies are performing better than they have done in the past and better than expected, we don't know what the Commission will come out with later this week in terms of forecasting, but if you look at the shorter-term outlook, it is being revised up in Europe as in many other areas. And that is a time when, of course, the kind of symmetric rule we are proposing as possibly the main element in the revision of the rules becomes very important, that there should be an adjustment of the program if things go better than anticipated. Certainly the automatic stabilizers nationally should be allowed to work rather fully, and then there should be also some extra effort, particularly in countries that have high levels of debt. So we think that this is an important element. We are also keen on looking a bit more broadly at national indicators of performance than simply the public finances. It's a sad fact that the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, which was introduced after the crisis and was seen, I think, as a major element of progress in looking at the broad balance between investment and saving in our economies was taken into account, and not just the public accounts. That has become too vague, too broadly oriented to have any operational linkage. We suggest some ways in which it could be linked to the surveillance according to the Stability and Growth Pact. Has the advantage that some of the indicators that go into the macroeconomic imbalance procedure, particularly the current account position, of course, is more readily observable and firm than many others. We do discuss also a more radical simplification of the rules. It's in a way paradoxical for a system that focuses strongly on fiscal sustainability in the long run, that debt is not, in a sense, the main criteria. And one can say that the surveillance process is focused primarily on the deficit. That has a justification, that is a way of controlling longer-term debt. But the debt is a meaningful indicator in the long run, and we do discuss that. And it's particularly important, of course, also at a time when debt levels have been stuck at very high levels in some of our countries, 4 or 5 of them at levels of more than 100%. But nevertheless, let me return to the balance between rules and other elements in the future governance, and to the euro area stabilization function. You may recall that one of the first slides had 2 bullet points there, that rules were criticized for being too lenient, too lax by one group of countries, and too strict, too rigid by another group of countries. We try to divide a little bit opinion here and analyze it, but we note that in the current context, of course, the tendency for more countries is probably to say the rule system maybe is good enough. In more normal situations for which it was designed in the 1990s, it should work all right. It should be less objectionable. We don't share that view either, because we do think that we have learned something from the crisis, that at times of stress and major shocks to either the European economies as a whole, as we saw in 2008 onwards, or more asymmetric shocks, which have been possibly a bit more rare than the symmetric ones, there is a case for doing something jointly, because national positions are simply too weak to generate a sufficient response. So we think there is a need for both better rules-based system and a euro area stabilization function. You can say that the euro area has in a way gone full circle, or the European integration process as far as fiscal governance is concerned has gone full circle. It started with great optimism way back when monetary union was first thought of, that we could do a lot through joint action on fiscal policy. Then there was complete disillusionment after the 70s and the 80s of the crisis. When the Maastricht Treaty was designed, there was also some disillusion about fiscal policy. How could fiscal policy even be stabilizing in normal cases? There were too many examples of countries pursuing pro-cyclical policies, and the argument that it would be even more difficult jointly to design and improve on stabilization policies gained some ground, and that was why there was no provision for a joint stabilization function in the euro area, I think, in the treaty itself, despite advocacy by many qualified academics and others. But that attitude has been modified. I think the sole reliance on individual responsibility and a rules-based system has to be tempered by the experience of the crisis and the legacy of the crisis, also the very high levels of debt. Also for the reason that, in contrast to the original perception when EMU was designed, that fiscal spillovers were not that significant. In normal times, they would be modest, certainly from small countries, and from large countries, they would be offset to some extent through monetary policy. That is not quite the case. We have seen during the crisis not only strong spillovers through trade, income links, and particularly strongly since there was no offsets through monetary policy to fiscal actions. Unfortunately, the evidence we have was to a large extent in a negative direction. In the early post-year crisis, 2011 to 13, all countries consolidated, and that gave an extra negative impulse to the economy. That was clearly, I think, in retrospect, a subject to be criticized. But now we are back in a little bit more of a more normal situation, but we have this other linkage now from fiscal policy through the financial markets and the high levels of debt that can lead, as we saw in 2010 onwards, to problems in sovereign debt markets. So that is the argument for saying we must look again at fiscal policy and more systematically, not in exactly the same way from year to year, because these two different kinds of spillovers sometimes go in opposite directions, but they both constitute a strong argument for taking more of a joint responsibility, a joint action than we've seen before. We note that there are some proposals already underway for how one could design a central fiscal stabilization function. We do discuss three ideas that are in the report of the Commission, the so-called reflection paper from May this year, where they say one idea is to protect public investment. We present also in our report some evidence how public investment has systematically been postponed and cut back during the crisis. There's been a defensive attitude to public expenditures that is not only harmful in terms of its multiplier effects on the economy, but also for the longer-term growth potential of the European economy. So therefore, somewhat more protection through joint efforts also of investment activity in the public sector is required, we think, for the future. And that is one idea that may be easier to implement also because that would be financed, as is indeed the case already with the early step to that, the so-called Juncker plan, through a borrowing scheme, which also then triggers private lenders into the process and leverages the whole efficiency of the idea. The problem with the investment protection scheme that it may be hard to design in a way that protects individual countries against the shocks, because the expenditures would be based more on general criteria of efficiency and so on, and would be more difficult to reconcile possibly with protection for individual countries. We also discuss two other ideas that are mentioned in the debate. One has a very long-standing, going back even to the 1970s. Jacques Delors was very keen on it in the 1990s, the Unemployment Reinsurance Fund, which on the surface of things certainly looks as an obvious stabilization mechanism, because it has not only political appeal, but the unemployment levels, movements in unemployment are also very significant national economic indicators of the performance of countries. So that is certainly an idea. The problem with that is it's very difficult to design the appropriate way that the rules could function, because you need to take into account that the levels of more structural elements of unemployment differ greatly among countries. And therefore the view, I think, of many outside academics has been that the scheme is for the long term, when there's been more harmonization of labor markets. That may be too pessimistic. There are ways, I know the Commission is working on some of them, to see how such a scheme could be devised and be ready. Finally, there's the idea of a rainy day fund, where, in a sense, the euro area tries to supplement up the national properties of the national stabilization policies in the automatic stabilizers. And at the most ambitious political level, there's the idea, of course, of using an enlarged European budget with an element of stabilization policy. That is very difficult, and we see also different ideas about that from France and from the European Commission in the President Juncker's State of the Union speech. But that is probably a subject more for the longer term. But we do draw attention to the fact that euro area fiscal governance function should not be looked only at as a stabilization idea. It's characteristic of older debates about fiscal policy in Europe that it also had other dimensions that we are used to in national fiscal policy, namely the role of public finances in increasing growth potential of our economies, the allocative efficiency function, and there's indeed also a distribution element. But it's strange, I think, that the European debate has so far been focused entirely on the stabilization function, but maybe with the European budget that horizon will somewhat broaden. So we try to present a mixture of more, let's say, concrete, shorter-term steps improving the rules. We think they are vital. We think the rules should not be as discredited as they are by many observers for one reason or the other. But we think it does need to be supplemented by a stabilization function. We agree with the priority that seems implicit in the Commission's own writings that maybe the first priority over the next couple of years is to deepen financial integration, take the final steps in banking union. That would also be a great relief to the concern about fiscal policy for the future. So we know that for the next 2 years or so, the priority seems to be to complete these steps with the fiscal backstop for the resolution fund and deposit insurance function, possibly also some steps to recognizing the riskiness of government bonds once more. But in the meantime, and this is essential, that the current relatively promising period in macroeconomic terms be used for reflecting on the euro area stabilization function. If that reflection only starts a couple of years from now, when the outlook may be less propitious, it would be a great shame. We think there are some ideas that ought to be developed further. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. Thank you very much, Matthäus, for both very interesting presentation. Loads of material here, and I'm sure we're going to have many questions already. There are some questions trickling in, and if I may pick up on one of the questions that one of our audience is actually raising, and it comes down to the fiscal capacity. This is, of course, a very big question, actually. And you made a number of suggestions in terms of what that centralized European capacity could do. You mentioned the rainy day, the investment fund, unemployment reinsurance. All these are very, very useful suggestions. The one question that I have is what type of fiscal capacity do you have in mind? And here is, what type of funds do we need to put aside in order for this fiscal capacity to be able to carry the functions that you want it to? So I think that's one question. And if I may ask one more question, and then I will open up the floor. There's a number of interesting inconsistencies here. Some people believe the rules are too lax, some people are too rigid. There may be good reasons for why we think in opposite directions. But a lot has to do with the complicated nature of the rules. And I certainly share with you the argument that simplicity here might, even if it leads to suboptimal rules, it might actually be better for their implementation and enforcement. But if you had to pick one, would you go for the deficit or would you go for the debt and try and enforce one of the two? Which one do you think would be a lot more effective, both in terms of bringing that coordination with the fiscal policy that we need, but also ensuring that the sustainability argument is also satisfied?
If I may take the first then of the
Please.
questions, then I will let Matthäus discuss the debt and deficit, which is, I think, a very hard one. But we don't express a strong preference at the moment for how a centralized fiscal capacity could be designed. We point out that probably the easiest to implement, both because it is politically, in a sense, tried already in small ways with the Juncker plan, the public investment scheme, the protection of public investment, the scaling up of that is easier also because that could be done by borrowing in the markets and by supplementing public resources by private resources more easily than in the other cases. But I think I also said that this does not have optimal stabilization properties from the viewpoint of individual countries, probably because as we see with these investment schemes, there's a tendency for them, quite rightly, to focus on the best, the most developed projects, and they may not necessarily lie in the countries that have the most strained public finances. But it would be maybe a somewhat more proportional, somewhat better designed for protecting all countries and joint shocks, symmetric shocks to the euro area. And we note, of course, that there's been also a massive shortage of investment in the stronger economies, in Germany and the Netherlands. Maybe that's being corrected through new governments in these countries. We don't know yet, but that's certainly one possibility. We think on paper some of the other ideas that are around the unemployment fund could have greater stabilization properties for the individual countries. It just needs to be designed very carefully because it is difficult to envisage a scheme that is based to a substantial extent on a more unobservable quantity, such as the more structural level of unemployment in a country. How do you judge whether it is simply a historical average or some other model-based estimates of the structural level of unemployment, because it's clear that it could not just be the pure unemployment figure, that the measured unemployment, that was the basis of it. But we think that that is certainly an idea that needs to be developed and studied much further. So we have no specific suggestion for the euro area budget. That would be beyond our competence, I think. But I think it's striking that there are now a number of tasks that national electors are also saying these tasks belong naturally at the European level, and still that is not really penetrating into the discussion about European resources for the next budget period and so on. There, of course, are also some possibilities for stabilizing our systems through these expenditures relating, be they to migration or security or energy policy or other subjects that are not yet, in a sense, communitarized in the system. So I let Mathias go on the deficit and debt.
Maybe if I could add one thing is that it is pretty obvious that any fiscal stabilization function is really an extraordinary thing to draw upon. And you do need really, really bad times for it to be useful. And in most other circumstances, we do have European Central Bank, and we do have national fiscal policy. And from that point of view, unemployment insurance is probably something that is bound to be delivered by member states anyway, which we cannot really say about some of the investments especially with sort of European externalities, which is why that might be somewhat preferable. On the rules, targets, our preference would rather be on debt rather than deficits in the longer run, as a quest towards simplicity. But I think it's worth sort of referring to what you just said, that complexity of the rules we might want to get rid of that even at the expense of smartness of them, because this has been the general trend for the past 10-20 years now, from simple but somewhat stupid rules towards far more advanced but utterly incomprehensible to the outside world rules. I think some of the complications that we are observing are a result of a difficulty of the European process, the treaties, the legacies that are difficult to get rid of because they require treaty change, or they're embedded in sort of original Maastricht documents, for example, or like I mentioned with the structural balance and the expenditure benchmark, which would be nice to have one, but some countries do not necessarily like that. So some of these complications are not really bringing us. I mean, we could have both simpler and reasonably smart, so that can still be done. But in the longer run, I think a reference to debt rather than deficits as the ultimate indicator is probably preferable. Let me just give you one example from my previous life. The fact that the rules are centered around deficit, and it is the deficit that is more binding. We also saw this in case of the countries we just mentioned, Belgium, for example, Italy, where debt procedure was not raised because countries were deemed compliant with deficit. One of the side effects, for example, is the unwillingness of some countries, Poland included in my times when I was in the government, to privatize too much. Why? Because privatization reduces debt, but does nothing to reduce deficit. If you don't privatize and you get dividends from publicly owned companies, then you reduce the deficit and have extra income. It is a statistical and rule-based phenomenon, really. An argument, of course, not deciding on some things, but it does have, I mean, both statistics and rules do have an impact on surprising range of public policy outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps we can open up the floor for questions. We can collect a couple of questions and come back to the here. Can you please here and tell us who you are, press, please?
Thank you. Thank you, Matteo Capo from the Council Secretariat. I'm just trying to find out, I understand that the European Fiscal Board are trying to use this fiscal stance, euro area fiscal stance, not as an outcome, but as an input for member states in their fiscal policies to be implemented. But how to conciliate this? So this is a question of distribution of the fiscal effort among member states in order to reach such a fiscal stance at the euro area. But that would imply that some member states have to implement expansionary fiscal policies because we have some others which are obliged by the treaties to consolidate their budgets. So we need some others who have to implement expansionary fiscal policies, so they have to use this famous fiscal space. But how to conciliate this with the need to focus on debt? Because those countries which are concerned by this fiscal space are concerned by the long-term sustainability of the public fiscal finances. They have concerns about increasing health cost, increasing pension costs in the future. They have still some high level of debt, relatively high. So it's difficult to conciliate both things. And perhaps also a word about this trade-off between fairness and simplification. So at the early days, we had a single rule, 60% debt and 3% deficit. But it didn't work. It was quite simple. But this has been adjusted over time to take into account the situation of member states. Now we are going back to the initial situation, but we will end up with the same problem. So where is the middle point?
Thank you very much. And if I may add to this, what is the use of the fiscal stance? Why is that a useful thing to look at? Surely it's more important to get approximately right the fiscal stance for every country, run exactly the euro area fiscal stance correct. So, you know, the composition issue, I think, so what is it that the euro area fiscal stance does other than just mimic the monetary policy side? But, you know, one could argue that if you do have a monetary policy side on the aggregate level, you need much more differentiation on the fiscal side in order to compensate for the fact that monetary policy is not exactly correct for everybody, but only on average. But okay, just to pick on this point, so, you know, why so much grey matter is being given on the euro area fiscal stand? What is the purpose? What does it? How does this? How do you achieve it? And what is the use of it actually? If I may be a little bit more provocative. Any other questions?
Yeah, in the back.
Sorry. Yes. Who? Oh yes, the lady on the back. Yes. I'm sorry, we can't hear you. Is the mic on?
Maybe? Hello?
Yeah, that's better.
Yes,
Yeah.
hi, Rebecca Christie. I'm a freelance journalist here in the area. I was wondering if you could come back to the idea of investor protection that came up in your recommendations. You talked about some sort of broader investor protection based on the Juncker plan. I'm wondering who it would protect, if it's for consumers, if it's for risk-averse institutional money like pension funds, if you're looking at generally trying to get capital off the sidelines by generally having the state take on some of the risk. I'd love to hear more of where you were going with that. Thank you.
Okay, perhaps we come back and have a second round of questions.
Sure.
Please.
Okay. Yes, let me take the question here. First from the first questioner. Yes, of course, the interesting thing is why did the rules degenerate in a way from what was intended originally? Won't we get back to the same problems if we reinforce them again? I think that there is probably a new mood after what we have learned in the meantime. But there's clearly also an understanding that the main problem lies still at the national level, and reconciling the problem of longer-term sustainability of public finances with shorter-term stabilization. Now is a good time to begin that effort at least, and consolidate a bit more, maybe bring the debt levels a bit down so that at least when the developments are less propitious, that we will have a somewhat easier time in reconciling at the national level fiscal rules and good behavior. You're right. Why spend so much time on this loose concept of the euro area fiscal stance? Because as you say quite rightly, in a monetary union, fiscal policy has to be pretty diverse in different countries. What meaning does it have to aggregate it from a stabilization point of view, or for that matter from a sustainability point of view? That trade-off is best much more clearly seen at the national level. That is true. It's an exercise where we felt that we had to take it up. It's in our mandate, and the Commission is spending a lot of time on it. But operationally, it is not all that obvious where it could lead. And I think we do point that out in our discussion, that the main problem is also one of allocation of the burden of adjustment inside the euro area. We do discuss to some extent the consequences if countries that are in a comfortable position, that have overperformed relative to their medium-term objective, if they were to use a bit more of their fiscal space defined in that way. And that does make a difference. Why they cannot be obliged to do so, because the medium-term objective is not really an objective, a target. It is an indicator in some sense of performance. We think that maybe one should move a little bit further than that and put more pressure on countries that have a very comfortable position. That would give more space to the others, and also improve sustainability. Clearly, we present some evidence on that. But as I say, the balance, the main balance still has to be made at the national level, and that is why we still think that the emphasis has to be there, but it has to be supplemented in extreme situations. And I agree with Matthäus's underlining that it is in exceptional circumstances, because we have not only of course, the ECB, we have the national fiscal rules for fiscal policy, we have also a stability mechanism these days, which comes in crisis times. The problem that we hint at in our report here is probably that some of these mechanisms are too remote to be fully effective if there is another crisis. And it's better to have mechanisms also that can come in before the full crisis mechanisms are triggered, before the ECB has to try to do another massive accommodation, before the ESM has to come into operation with a national program. There should be some provision for doing it in the meantime. And that is the difficult design that we have not solved certainly yet, nor has anyone else, as far as I can see, finding a balance of how do you do that without then, in a sense, undermining also some of the inducements for national rules to operate properly, which we are very keen that they should do. So the two should be linked. Compliance with the national rules would be still a condition for meeting, drawing on the joint facilities. Matthäus, would you take the other question on the investment?
On the investment protection, I hope the wording got right across the room. We were not talking about investors' protection scheme and bailing out investors in various sectors, but rather preventing a situation where a fiscal adjustment goes entirely via reduction of public investments. Of course, it is, I mean, the Juncker plan did bring an important lesson. And my day job is European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which has three rules of that it always applies. That is sound banking, additionality, and transition impact. And the three are really important. And we did have a conflict between the two. The first two, for example, in case of the Juncker plan. If we concentrate only on sound banking, there is a risk of crowding out private financing of viable investment schemes, and it's important to avoid that. And it's important to make sure that we are pursuing also either community or at least public public returns that are not easily bankable. And that is something that should always be taken into account when investing public money, either European or national, into an investment project. That is something is bankable without any problems, then it will be financed privately anyway. So it's not really a problem.
There are a few questions that are trickling in as we speak. If I may take a couple of those, I think they're more or less in the same line of thinking as the questions we had so far. There's a question here on the role of the EGP sanctions and can they ever be credibly implemented? So the issue of sanctions, I think that's a general question, but it's an important one, and particularly if you want to look at the enforcement and the compliance and the bad record of the compliance. Then there is this issue of very specific questions about what is your evaluation of the European Commission recommendations on implementation of the rules in 2012? They're rather more complex here than 2016. So I know you concentrated on 2016 here, but if you had any thoughts on the past, because that's surely we can learn from that. And then let's take one more question. Here's an interesting question. In what ways does the European Fiscal Board support the work of national fiscal councils? Let me take it at that and then come back also from questions from the audience.
Let me start on the first one then, on the sanctions.
We could actually use a slide that we haven't shown.
Oh yeah, if we can put the slides back on, please.
Yeah.
Fast forward.
We of course, we take note of the fact that sanctions have not been applied effectively, and maybe they cannot be applied under different structures. They were not applied when the governments were in charge before the 2005 revision, or before the crisis. They have not been applied by the Commission when, in principle, the Commission was given authority to make recommendations that were very difficult to turn down because that would require a qualified majority against. So that's the political reality. The political reality is, of course, also that behind that lies the notion that it's not reasonable to impose economic burdens on public finances at a time when they are already very strained. That argument was made from the start. Skeptics on the Maastricht Treaty said that. That's why we discuss also a couple of other sanctions mechanisms if you want to retain some form of sanction. But one of them hasn't been applied. Well, one has been applied in one case, I think in the case of Hungary, the European structural funds. That is a somewhat blunt instrument because it doesn't work in connection with several countries that do not receive major funds through these mechanisms. The procedure is also extremely complex because the European Parliament is involved and there are very long delays in applying such a process. So we mentioned that if one wants to have some sanctions, they should be based on a wider idea, namely through the whole EU budget, including other expenditures than those we have talked about so far. But basically, I think we do have some skepticism as to whether sanctions can effectively be applied and whether one could get to a system where simply the force of arguments and clear and simpler rules maybe and access to common facilities could together provide the basis for acceptance of and says that you need to behave well and live up to the obligations you have undertaken. That, I think, is our basic message.
So if I may dig further on that, so it's almost like you're saying we need to move away from sanctions to more incentive-compatible measures. That these are the good incentives, those bad incentives. But so that question is, how do you do that?
Yeah.
And here's actually a question that came also: is how do you ensure that fiscal policy is actually counter-cyclical? So in the bad times you don't penalize those who need it, and in the good times you do have you collect. This is the symmetry of your rules, if I understand correctly. This is where you're getting at. But how do you create incentive compatibility? How do you promote incentive compatibility that is going to lead to to what Niels is actually just described?
I mean, first of all, the fact that if we are talking about sanctions, they really, really should be biting in good times. They really should be not necessarily centered around structural investment funds, which we might want to protect anyway, but the funds in general. That's one thing. Secondly, before we turn into the carrot, which is all nice, but it's nice to have a carrot in the first place. So something that the loss of which would be or lack of access to would be really problematic. If we're talking about the credit line in times of stress, for example, it is again it's not really credible. I would rather lean towards a situation where we have if we're talking about the rainy day fund, for example, again, a country would need to pay towards it, so it could use it down in bad times. Yeah.
So like insurance?
A bit like that, but again, the contributions to the fund would be happening in a positive cyclical situation. In any case, the problem is not just with the sanctions. It's also with the fact that it's easier to escape and be compliant with the rules when times are good. It should be the other way around, and that especially applies to the corrective arm. So the excessive deficit procedure. I know this also from my first-hand experience, because that's partially how Poland exited the excessive deficit procedure 2 years ago. So,
why is it so difficult to impose sanctions in good times?
Why it's difficult in good times?
Yeah. Why can't we not do that? Why haven't we done that? Why is it difficult? In the bad times
because
we'll see that
the political logic on budgets is very different from those of economists like us in the Fiscal Board. I mean, politicians feel, particularly towards the end of a long crisis, that now is the time that we can spend some more. And we meet this kind of interest group that has been somewhat neglected over the past 4 or 5 years. So. It's not necessarily easier in good times in the political sense. It ought to be, but it isn't. So that's why I think the political process simply underpins it. May I take up your second question about 2012?
Oh, yes.
It's no accident that we didn't discuss 2012. I think that would be too difficult. We say 2016 was a difficult year, but much less so. 2012, of course, was the year where you could say, and it comes back to one of your earlier remarks, that fiscal recommendations were insufficiently differentiated. Everybody was consolidating at that time, even those that had the relatively best performance. And that made for a strong contractionary force throughout the euro area, which was fortunately saved to some extent, to a considerable extent, by the ECB action, by the setup of new institution framework for banking union, which regenerated some confidence and made the sustainability issues a little bit or much less urgent than they seemed at the beginning of that year. But that was clearly a case of where more discussion of a euro area fiscal stance could have been appropriate. But it shows, I think, also that there's a tendency for governments to follow a bit herd-like behavior. And when the crisis struck in 2009, we had the opposite situation where all countries were encouraged to expand because of the crisis. And of course, some massive expansion was required. But the fact that we had such a severe crisis in several countries in the euro area was in part due to the fact that they spent more resources in 2009-10 than they had a basis for, and that aggravated their subsequent crisis. So if we had gone a bit further back in history, we would have had rich source material for maybe pushing more for the idea of a euro area fiscal stance, which was more remote once we get to 2016, not to speak of 2018.
And maybe, because I think you might be disappointed somewhat by the answers that you got to your question about how to ask individual countries to contribute to euro area fiscal stance on a positive side, so on a spending side. I mean, first of all, if we're talking about fiscal space with reference to the MTO, which itself has a long-term debt sustainability component in it, then your accusation is maybe blunted somewhat because, well, of course, the countries with fiscal space also care about the long-term debt sustainability, the aging, healthcare costs, and so forth. But that's reasonably well taken into account with the MTO. So if you have plenty of room towards it, then there is some room to maneuver. It, of course, doesn't answer the question of how to deal with different approaches to long-term sustainability, different national approaches. And are we in a position as Europeans to tell any nation, you know, you should really be less careful about 30 years down the line, the future. And I think this is part of being in the monetary union or even European Union. I mean, there is some things that you have to give up in a sense in order to take into account for externalities of your actions, which are particularly big when interest rates are at zero. So yes, you might be in a position that would be suboptimal from your own national interests, but that's the whole point of community-based policy, that what you're doing is impacting others, and especially strongly if we're at zero lower band. Actually, the same applies to the monetary policy. We have one interest rate, so that might be overheating your economy or depressing someone else's economy. We still agree to it.
But on this very last point, because I mean, this is now really the key. I think you've gotten really at the key. Can you really achieve that without a change in governance?
Of course, you cannot. I mean,
okay.
I mean,
Okay, but that's...
you certainly cannot, because the rules as they are set now are asymmetrical also in this respect, meaning that they can prevent you or try to at least try to prevent you from running excessive deficits, but certainly not force anyone to spend more.
Sure. Okay, any more questions from you, please? Sivan. First Sivan and the gentleman there. Yeah.
Silva Plaskart, University of Leuven. Well, we have heard a lot about, what countries should do, national countries should do to really conform to the prescriptions. But about 6 months ago, Commissioner Moscovici was speaking here in Brussels, and he seemed quite committal to the idea of moving forward with, let's say, a scheme to come to some coordination of the corporate taxation, the famous scheme about the consolidated base. I didn't hear much about it unless I was really absent-minded, but this is probably a dish which is also on the menu of the fiscal board, I would think. What is the fate of that? Can we still hope that this will happen? Because it would be a major step forward, isn't it?
Thank you. And then the gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Risto Nieminen from European Parliamentary Research Service. I go back to the question of sanctions and the question of the credibility of the Stability and Growth Pact. So the question was that why there are no sanctions, why for example, macro imbalance procedure sanction part have never been activated, although we have enough evidence that it should have been activated. So it is the Commission who has the right to make a recommendation. Without the recommendations, Council can't decide. Therefore, there has been papers and discussion that we should have a kind of external body who assess the compliance with the Stability and Growth Pact, not the Commission, but the external party. So what would be your views of this question?
Yeah, and Gregory?
Just one quick question. I have also been studying the fiscal framework, and I have this sentiment that the expenditure benchmark is much less used by the Commission and by anyone than the structural deficit. And I was wondering if you had any explanation, why do you think the structural deficit, which is more flawed according to some calculations that we have made, because there are a lot of measurement error, etc., why is it much more prominent than the expenditure benchmark, even though we and other people, for example, like the IMF, think that it's better?
I'm not sure whether that is actually true. We have discussed a number of cases where both criteria have been used and give somewhat different answers. I agree that the expenditure benchmark could be certainly seen as making the rules a bit more simple and objective, easier to measure than monitor than the structural deficits. But I think that there is a tendency for the expenditure benchmark to gain more prominence in the surveillance process. That is certainly the idea we get from the Commission. And I think you will find also support for that view in our report. So we're not in disagreement on that point. I don't think we're looking at tax issues, tax harmonization. That's really beyond our own mandate. I'm sorry, but we're looking more at the simple fiscal indicators such as the deficit and debt, not either at the individual components of expenditure, of course.
And then on the sanctions, I don't know if you had something on the need for an external body to...
Just on the just to corroborate on the expenditure benchmarks. I mean, since 2017, there was indeed a tendency to rely on that. Either two indicators were in conflict for individual countries. So yes, with the exception of Germany and probably Lithuania as well, we would be probably ready to politically understand to move towards expenditure benchmark as a main target, operational target of that kind, and it is also politically, to me at least, more useful because it's easier to explain to the general public of what you're doing, what you're targeting, rather than relying on output gap estimates and various NAIRU forecasts and so forth. So it is more.
If I may reframe the question, I was not saying that in your reports and you are making structural deficit more prominent. I think in the Commission recommendations in the past, it seems that there was more space devoted to structural deficits and to the structural deficit rule and the compliance to structural deficit than to the expenditure benchmark. You see what I mean?
I understand what you mean, but it's our understanding is that the Commission itself is also moving for the past year and a bit towards that indicator. On the okay, I mean this is the fact that macroeconomic imbalance procedure was not used as much as it could be. It's the gradations of imbalances that are proposed are almost humorous. I mean, at the risk. Well, I mean, you know what I mean. So it is indeed our view is that macroeconomic imbalances are important. They are also important from the point of view of assessment where the country actually is in terms of its business cycle. It's a very useful, at least part of the MIP indicators, the useful help in assessing whether the economy is overheating or not. Also, macroeconomic imbalances they have a political influence over the way the union works. If a country is crediting all the other countries consistently, then it does have political implications. 10 years down the line. So it is a problem in its own, not just an indicator. Not to mention the resilience and credibility of any growth model that is based on excessive borrowing from abroad. Whether there should be a stricter enforcement or actions, recommendations related to it, we have not discussed that in an outright way in writing. But yes, MIP indicators, they should supplement the way fiscal policy of a country is being assessed. That's what we think.
But if I may say on this MIP, to be fair a little bit to both the Commission and the process, I mean, the fact that the categories went from few to more to few was also something to do with the teething process of the process itself. Sure. I mean, there's a learning curve. It's quite steep, actually. Yeah. And it plays right into that trade-off we were discussing later on versus, being, very granular versus being complex, fair versus. So I think that, in this respect, one could argue that now we are more or less stabilizing in the way that we approach the Commission approaches rather the MIP. I mean, this is the way that I would read it. But what I'm not so clear on is still on this question is why is there a need for an independent body to issue sanctions when the Commission has got not the authority to recommend that? I mean, why do we need to have a different institution, independent institution, when that is the role of the Commission? What problem would that be trying to solve? The integration of the fiscal rules and the MIP, of course, makes a lot of sense because we are talking about the macroeconomic management. But why should we differentiate on who sort of recommends the sanctions before we even get to the enforceability of the sanctions? I'm not so sure what problem we're trying to solve by creating an independent authority that would recommend that, when the Commission, that is in the realm of what the Commission must do.
Who is arguing for that?
Oh, sorry, the question was suggestive of that, right? I mean, that was what the question was. It's a difficult question, actually, but I mean, I think we do have a way of, we have a recommendation procedure, we have a decision procedure.
Because, I mean, our mandate, for example, does certainly not envisage recommending sanctions against anyone, and we're very happy with that. I'm not actually. I'm certainly not arguing for this, for an independent body to be created only to deal with MIP. I'm not really sure this is something that would be easily implementable.
Right.
Any final thoughts? Any else on this? No? Are there any questions from the audience? Oh, we have two more questions, and we need to take them. Chris, and then the gentleman in the back.
Yes, I'm Christian from the IMF. I have a question regarding the CFC, and you did not discuss, for example, the usefulness of the CFC, for example, in triggering structural reforms. There are some proposals, for example, country doing structural reform can access the CFC money in order to ease the pain of the reform in the short run, but also the role of the CFC in creating a safe asset, because that could also be an automatic enforcer of the fiscal rule if country really can issue the new debt through this safe asset, for example, with a certain threshold. I'm talking about, for example, the SB proposal. That could also enforce the fiscal rule directly or automatically, because there will be charged a higher rate when the debt, for example, surpasses the threshold that is done by the safe asset, for example.
Thank you, Christian. And one last question here at the back before we have to.
Yes, Chef Pacolet from the Catholic University of Leuven. I had a comment on the trade-off between talking about the structural balance. I think that's a target, And the expenditures benchmark, I consider that as only benchmarking, or is it also targeting? But then the question is, in what direction you are targeting? And a more problematic question now comes up when I listen just that your mandate is not about fiscal policy, about tax policy. I am wondering how you can talk about expenditures benchmarking without talking about taxation benchmarking or even targeting. Another small remark is about the relationship between privatization and debt. I thought that public firms, private or not public, is about structural policy, and debt is about macroeconomic or fiscal policy, and there is no direct relationship for me between your structural ambition to have public firms, for instance. That's another ambition, that's another strand of economic policy.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me maybe address the first question from the gentleman from the IMF. Was the experience of in a sense, facilitating structural policy has not been all that promising in the European Union. Maybe it could be on a different scheme, but if you look at there are already, of course, this criterion of taking into account structural reforms when you discuss the fiscal rules. Italy has benefited from it to some extent, but there's been little use of that. It's very difficult to design, in a sense, contracts about structural policy. Maybe easier once you have also concrete funds on the table. I fully agree with that, but it is not an easy area to go into. So that's why we have kept, I think, also this discussion of the investment protection scheme in more general terms than that. Would you take the other question?
Yes. Also on the safe assets, I understand the idea is also to strengthen the market mechanism into the framework to make sure that markets differentiate and, in a sense, indicate or punish immediately missteps in fiscal policy. The trouble with that, without saying that there's no merit in it, the trouble with this is that my own experience with financial markets, and I worked for financial markets for 1.5 decades, is that they're quickly getting blind where things get reasonably well. Meaning that the time span is rather short, and I have my doubts about the translation of policy missteps in good times into markedly higher yields. And when they're really immediately damaging, that is in bad times, and then we'll have the same problem as we already had, and we have a problem with enforcement so facing the crisis and being cut off from external financing altogether. And then the credibility of IMF doing nothing, for example, in such circumstances is somewhat limited, or even desirability of such a setup. So we could end up with a system that is really shock creating rather than shock absorbing. It would be nice to have sort of instant online feedback into yields also in good times, but I have my doubts whether how useful this would be. On the tax policy and our mandate, well, the way the expenditure benchmark is constructed is that it includes any changes in tax policies. So if you are introducing a new tax that under the expenditure benchmark framework, you're entitled to spend more. So implicitly, of course, we do take this into account, but not separately. Yeah, so not just spending, not just taxes, but the balance of the two, but not created by cyclical factors, but actual policy actions that introduce new spending items without corresponding tax revenues in the longer run. On the privatization thing, it was just a side comment, certainly not debated in the European Fiscal Board. Just as my illustration that the way you set up fiscal rules or you look at statistics does influence surprising things.
Yes, please.
May I come back to one point that Matthäus took up, I think also still in response to the IMF question. Took me right back to the early discussions about monetary union and the role of market forces in monitoring country performance. The idea, of course, of having fiscal rules was that market discipline would not be adequate. It would not react for a very long time, and markets would be much too tolerant, particularly in good times with the smaller nuances between the performance of countries. That I think, has been borne out by experience. Also then that markets react suddenly and very violently. The hope with the fiscal rules was that this would also provide some guidance, some interaction with markets, securities markets. But one consequence of the complication of the rules and the perception that the rule system has been eroded, somehow become too flexible, has been that it is not really discussed by market participants at all, as it should be. Maybe with a simpler system of rules, we can come back to a more fruitful interaction between market processes and the kind of things that government officials, or the Commission at least, tries to look at. That would be, I think, one positive step.
Thank you very much for that. Matthäus, any last words? Or lovely. So that's all really we have time for today. Thank you both very much for coming, and we're looking forward to seeing some of this implementation. That would be that of course is another issue. But thank you very much for coming, and we look very much forward to reading your work further. Please join me in thanking the speakers, Niels, Matthäus. Thank you.